Okay, let's unpack this. When you think about the 19th century, you're looking at this incredible moment of intellectual ambition, just massive philosophical machines being built.
Totally. You have these grand sweeping systems like Hegelianism or what would later become Marxism, and they're all trying to explain everything, the entire swip of human history, knowledge, society.
And they were philosophies of the mass, right?
Yeah.
They were trying to solve problems for the collective, for society as a whole.
Exactly. But running right alongside that and in, fundamental opposition to it was this rival philosophy, a way of thinking that wasn't looking at the collective, but was instead trying to dive deep into the turbulent, unique core of the singular human heart.
And that's where we're going today. We are charting the origins of existentialism.
And its father, Søren Kierkegaard, a man whose intense personal pain really became the foundation for a universal philosophy.
We're calling him the Danish Gadfly, and that's not just a catchy nickname.
No, it's vital. The comparison to Socrates, the original gadfly of Athens, is completely intentional. Kierkegaard saw his mission as being this stinging critic. He wanted to wake people up.
Waking them up from what, exactly?
Form a kind of spiritual and intellectual lethargy. He looked at his contemporaries in Denmark and saw them as just, comfortably asleep in their assumptions, especially their religious ones. He wasn't trying to build a new system. He was trying to dismantle the illusion they were living under.
And that illusion, that lethargy, it had a name, didn't it? It was institutionalized by the prevailing intellectual movement of his time.
G.W.F. Hegel. You absolutely have to grasp what Kierkegaard was fighting to understand his project.
So what was the problem with Hegel? I mean, on the surface, it sounds pretty impressive.
Oh, it was elegant. It was comprehensive. Hegel offered this view of reality where everything fit perfectly into a rational system. The individual person was just, a temporary stage, a cog in the grand machinery of history that was moving inevitably toward what he called the absolute spirit.
It's an intellectual machine that can basically ingest every contradiction, every person, every historical event, and then spit it out and say, see, it was all logically necessary.
That's it, exactly. And for Kierkegaard, this was a dangerous, even horrifying erasure.
Because if the system explains everything, then it explains away the specific, concrete, living person, your choices, your suffering. It doesn't really matter.
Right. It's like Hegel built this massive, rationally perfect, philosophical cathedral where every single stone has its predetermined place. And Kierkegaard's project was to dig down to one of those single, miserable foundation stones and just declare, this stone is suffering, this stone is afraid, and your perfect system doesn't account for its misery or its freedom.
So our mission today is to take a deep dive into Kierkegaard's work, which was, as you said, not some detached academic exercise.
Not at all. We're going to show you how his philosophy, his whole lifelong struggle to articulate what it means to be an existing individual in the face of absolute uncertainty, was really this passionate, painful architecture of inwardness. And it was forged entirely in his own psychological distress.
We set up the philosophical enemy Hegel system, but to really understand the weapon Kierkegaard created to fight it, we have to understand the man himself.
Let's turn to the life of Søren Kierkegaard, born in Copenhagen, 1813. And when we say his philosophy was forged in the crucible of personal pain, that is not an exaggeration. He suffered from this severe melancholy his entire life.
And that melancholy wasn't just incidental to his writing, was it? Its very fuel.
It was the engine, and you see it in how he wrote. He didn't just write philosophy, he dramatized it. His work is this intricate web of pseudonyms.
Names like Johannes de Silencio, Constantine Constantius, Victor Eremita.
Right, and these weren't just pen names to hide his identity. They were distinct literary personalities. Each one represented a specific philosophical viewpoint or a different stage of existence. He called it indirect communication.
Why do that? Why not just say what he means?
Because he believed that objective truth, especially about life's big questions, couldn't just be handed over to you like a fact in a textbook. The reader had to wrestle with these competing viewpoints and discover the truth inwardly for themselves.
But through all that complexity, through all the different voices, his focus was always laser sharp on one thing.
The single individual. His entire project, every book, every pseudonym, revolved around isolating, defending, and analyzing that unique human being against the crowd, the mass, and the system.
So let's get to the root of that melancholy. Where did it come from?
It was a heavy, inherited burden from his father, Michael Pedersen Kierkegaard. On the outside, his father was a success story, a wealthy merchant. But internally, his life was just dominated by this strict, almost suffocating piety.
And a whole lot of guilt.
An immense, deep-seated guilt. The source material is very clear on this. His father was convinced he'd committed an unforgivable sin as a young boy, out on the Jutland Heaths. He had cursed God.
And he carried that his whole life.
Like a chain. He genuinely believed that the early deaths of his wife and 5 of his 7 children were direct divine punishment for that one act of blasphemy.
I just can't imagine the trauma of growing up in that house. It's so heavy.
It was deeply scarring for Søren. He grew up with this idea that he, too, was destined for a brief, melancholic life. His father was convinced he was cursed to outlive all of his children.
So this dark, suffocating environment, it becomes the raw material for his philosophy, doesn't it? When he writes about sin and guilt and especially dread, it's not abstract.
Not at all. It explains why concepts like inherent dread and inherited spiritual malaise are so central to his masterpiece, The Sickness Unto Death. He lived it.
But that intensity also gave him an intellectual edge.
It did. His peers at university recognized it. They called him Gadfly, which means the fork, because he had this uncanny, almost surgical ability to point out the inconsistencies in the arguments of the Danish elite. He could just pinpoint the weak spot.
He studied theology, but his real passion was philosophy and literature, where he could directly engage with the big challenge of the day, Hegel.
And this all leads us to the defining private event of his life. It wasn't an intellectual battle, it was a personal one. His engagement to Regine Olsen.
This wasn't just a breakup. This was a philosophical rupture that basically dictated the entire path of his life and work.
Absolutely. After a 3-year courtship, he abruptly broke off the engagement in 1841. And it wasn't because he fell out of love with her. He was convinced that his deep, pervasive melancholy combined with what he saw as his calling.
This consuming vocation to be a writer, a religious corrective.
Exactly. He felt that made a standard ethical marriage impossible for him. He believed he couldn't offer her the stability or the simple, open devotion that the ethical life required. He would destroy her.
And that agonizing private choice, the pain of sacrificing his own worldly happiness for what he saw as a higher internal necessity, that becomes the direct backdrop for his first major work.
Either or. The book literally dramatizes the choice he had just made in his own life. The choice between the aesthetic mode of existence, sensual, self-indulgent, and the ethical mode committed, duty-bound.
It's incredible how directly you can map his personal pain onto his philosophical output.
It's a one-to-one correlation. The paternal guilt and inherited melancholy. That leads directly to The Sickness Unto Death, his war against Hegel's abstract system. That produces the concluding unscientific postscript. And the intense struggle over Regine Olsen, that moment of choice and sacrifice.
It's the engine for both either-or and fear and trembling. His agony was his intellectual fuel.
And that intense internal biography leads us right into his most famous contribution for understanding human potential. The 3 stages on life's way.
Okay, so the 3 stages. Aesthetic, ethical, and religious. This is crucial, isn't it? These aren't like chronological steps, not like childhood, adolescence, adulthood.
Not at all. He was very clear about that. They are optional lifestyles, or what he called spheres of existence. They represent fundamentally different ways an individual can relate to reality, and most importantly, how they choose or refuse to build a stable self.
It's so important to stress this. You don't just naturally graduate from one stage to the next.
No. He argued that many people, maybe most people, live their entire lives without ever moving past the first stage. The transition between them requires something radical. A qualitative shift, a decisive act of the will, a leap.
So let's break down the first one, the aesthetic stage.
The aesthetic stage is defined by the pursuit of immediate pleasure, sensuousness, and above all, the constant avoidance of boredom. The individual here is primarily a spectator, an observer, a connoisseur of experiences, but not really an active participant in their own life.
This is the person who is, on the outside, often very charming and cultivated, right? The ultimate consumer of culture. The skilled flirt, the brilliant conversationalist who can talk about art and philosophy.
But it's all a performance. The exterior masks an internal void. They are fundamentally incapable of genuine, committed openness in a relationship because commitment limits possibility. And for the aesthete, possibility is everything.
It's a kind of refined hedonism. They're always relying on imagination and novelty to keep things interesting.
Kierkegaard describes the psychology of it so brilliantly. The goal of the aesthete is to live without consequence. They refuse to choose. Because if you choose one thing, you by definition close the door on other things, other potential pleasures.
And that refusal to choose means you never actually achieve a stable, unified self. You're just constantly dissolving into the next moment, the next experience.
Which leads to the internal conflict of the aesthetic life: despair. The ascete tries to turn the quality of life into a quantity of experiences. They're always accumulating moments, but because there's no anchor of commitment, the repetition of pleasure eventually loses its intensity.
It leads to a profound emptiness, a spiritual impotence. The ultimate sin here isn't necessarily, being immoral in a big way. It's the refusal to choose to be a self.
And the character A in Either Or is the perfect embodiment of this. He's witty, he's reflective, he's intellectually brilliant. But he finds every duty, every relationship to be binding and contemptible. His charming exterior hides a core that is spiritually empty because he refuses to commit to being someone specific.
And this is such a crucial takeaway for anyone listening. You have to ask yourself, are you living a life of momentary detached pleasures, constantly chasing novelty to avoid being bored, but without any deep binding commitments to a self or to others?
Right.
That is the aesthetic trap.
And the only way out, according to Kierkegaard, is this profound moment of realization, a recognition that the external chase for novelty is inherently empty, and that forces the individual to finally make a foundational choice.
And that choice, the choice to choose, is what forces you into the second sphere,
the ethical stage.
So the transition to the ethical stage is a move away from fleeting personal taste and toward a conscious embrace of the universal rule of conduct.
Exactly. The individual stops being the self-serving spectator and decides to become an actor and a citizen. This is the realm of responsibility and duty.
The ethical person recognizes that true meaning isn't found in endless possibility, but in submitting to the laws of society, fulfilling the requirements of your role, and embracing commitments: family, your job, your community.
You choose to participate in the universal moral order. And the advocate for this stage in Either Or, Judge William, makes a really powerful case for it.
He says the aesthete is just lost in randomness, living poetically but not actually living. True freedom, he argues, doesn't come from the endless, scattered options of the aesthetic life.
No, it comes from the deliberate, powerful choice to be bound by duty and moral law. It brings structure and integrity. You build a self-worth based on universal standards, not just passing whims.
But, and this is a huge but, the ethical stage is not the final answer. It has its own internal contradictions, its own specific kind of despair.
Yes, most notably, guilt and finitude. As the ethical person strives really rigorously to meet the requirements of the universal moral law, they become acutely and painfully aware of their own limitations.
You realize that the perfect moral law, what you ought to be, is impossible to fill through your own finite, flawed efforts. What you are. You try to be a perfect parent, a perfect spouse, a perfectly honest citizen, but you will inevitably fail.
And you become more and more aware of your inherent guilt, a guilt that can't be fixed by just trying harder.
So this creates a despair that's even deeper than what the aesthete felt, doesn't it?
It is. Because while the ethical life is superior, the individual has finally chosen a self, it can lead to what Kierkegaard calls infinite resignation. It's this despairing recognition that you can never truly be good enough, that the gap between your finite self and the absolute moral requirement is unbridgeable.
The ethical person is left paralyzed by their own moral inadequacy.
And this new, deeper crisis forces the ultimate either-or choice. It demands a transition to the third and most radical stage.
The religious stage. This is the highest sphere of existence for Kierkegaard, but you don't get there by just thinking your way through the problem. It's not a smooth, rational progression.
It's a radical break. It requires a decisive act of commitment, the famous leap of faith.
And this is where he really took issue with his own time, right?
Oh, absolutely. What he saw in his 19th century contemporaries was a profound lack of the necessary passion for this. They were rational, they were polite, they were comfortable. They had turned faith into an intellectual system of doctrines.
All had no heart.
Precisely. He looked back to figures like Abraham in the Old Testament and saw this raw, agonizing commitment, and he lamented that his world had lost those tons of passion.
So this stage is defined by an absolute relationship with the absolute God. The individual is now the believer, or what he calls the knight of faith.
And this is key. The individual's obedience doesn't flow from social conformity or even from an abstract ethical consistency. It flows from a passionate, personal, and totalizing love for the lawgiver. It is a relationship defined entirely by that passionate inwardness.
But because it demands a relationship that goes beyond rational thought, and even beyond the universal ethical law, the internal state of this knight of faith is one of
paradox and risk. You are moving beyond the comfortable known world of reason and duty. You are staking your entire existence on a commitment that cannot be rationally justified to society or even to yourself.
And it's that terrifying risk that brings us to what might be his most profound work, Fear and Trembling.
Because his core question was always about authentic faith. How to live as a Christian when Christianity had become culturally acceptable and therefore comfortable.
And he uses the biblical story of Abraham being commanded to sacrifice his son, Isaac, the child of promise, as the ultimate test case for a true faith that has to transcend the ethical.
This is where we get to that famous radical question he poses through his pseudonym, Johannes de Silentio. Is there such a thing as a teleological suspension of the ethical?
We have to slow down and break that down. That's a mouthful.
It is. So the ethical is the universal moral requirement. In this case, the basic binding prohibition against murder, specifically killing your own child. This applies to everyone. It's the foundation of society.
Okay, so the universal rule, what about teleological suspension?
That means asking if this universal rule, the one that governs all human interaction, can be temporarily set aside for a higher telos, a higher goal, which is dictated by an absolute, non-rational higher power. God, in this case.
And the source material is adamant that Abraham's act of obedience is not the act of a tragic hero.
No, that's a critical distinction. A tragic hero sacrifices a personal good, like a child, for a higher ethical universal, for the good of the state or the city or a political cause. That's still understandable within the ethical stage.
But Abraham isn't doing that. He's making a solitary move toward God as a single individual. His relationship with the absolute is absolute, and it transcends society.
And that's why his act is so terrifying and so isolating. If Abraham had tried to explain to his neighbor, or even to his wife Sarah, why he was taking Isaac up that mountain, they would have locked him up. They would have thought he was insane.
It can't be rationally justified.
It can't. And that's what makes it the defining act of the Night of Faith. It transcends rational reckoning and is motivated solely by a passionate love for the lawgiver. The life of faith, for Kierkegaard, must necessarily include fear and trembling, dread and anxiety.
And there's another layer to it, the most paradoxical part, which just heightens the terror, the nature of Abraham's belief.
Yes, his faith wasn't just his willingness to sacrifice Isaac, which is agonizing enough. It was his paradoxical belief that he would somehow receive Isaac back in this life. He held two utterly contradictory beliefs at the same time. He would obey the command to kill his son, and he would still have the child of promise.
That is the ultimate expression of the religious stage, a personal relationship with the absolute that can't be understood, can't be justified, can't be rationalized to the universal moral code. It's the final break from the ethical.
And we've hit the core tension. Kierkegaard has established that the highest, most meaningful existence requires this non-rational, absolute commitment, which leads us directly to the most famous and often the most controversial idea of his entire project.
Here's where it gets really interesting. From his concluding unscientific postscript, truth is subjectivity.
And this is where he just fully breaks with the entire tradition of objective, detached philosophy, especially Hegel. For the existing concrete individual, the how of your belief, the intensity and passion of your commitment, is fundamentally more important than the what of its objective content.
He argues that we can strive for objective certainty about external reality in science, math, history, but when it comes to the ultimate questions,
God, the meaning of life, eternal happiness.
Rational certainty is impossible. Objective knowledge in those areas only ever leads to approximation and probability. You can never prove God exists through reason alone.
So if objective certainty is off the table for the most important questions, how do we find truth? And Kierkegaard defines truth not as a factual certainty, but as, and this is the quote, an objective uncertainty held fast through appropriation with the most passionate inwardness.
The truth isn't in the external object you believe in. It's in your passionate subjective commitment to it.
And to illustrate this radical idea, he gives us this brilliant and frankly disturbing prayer analogy.
Okay, let's hear it.
He asks us to contrast two men. The first is a highly educated church member. He holds perfectly orthodox views. He knows all the right dogmas, all the right historical facts about the faith. But he prays with a lukewarm, detached, false spirit.
His heart's not in it.
Not at all. Kierkegaard says this man is effectively praying to an idol because there's no real engagement. Now, contrast him with the second man, a heathen, who prays sincerely to a literal idol, an object that is objectively false. But he does so with true passion and total sincere devotion.
Wait a minute. So Kierkegaard is genuinely arguing that a sincere pagan praying to a false god is closer to the truth than a lukewarm Orthodox Christian. That sounds incredibly radical.
It is radical, and he defends it by focusing entirely on the internal act. He asserts that the second man is actually closer to God because truth is found in the inward how, not the external what. The highest truth for the individual is not the objective content, but the passionate inwardness, the sincerity, the commitment that results in a personal transformation.
So if we lay this out, the distance is clear. Objective truth focuses on the what, the facts, the content. Subjective truth focuses on the how, the manner of appropriation, the passion to commitment.
Right. And we do need to add a crucial caveat here. When Kierkegaard says truth is subjectivity, he's not necessarily saying objective reality doesn't exist. He's not an anti-realist.
It's more about how we know things, not what is real.
Exactly. It's epistemological. He says what is out there is an objective uncertainty, which implies that certainty about these ultimate realities is simply inaccessible to our rational proof. And that's what makes faith necessary. You can't think your way into the religious life. You have to choose and live your way in.
But this subjective method is obviously not without risk. Critics have pointed out that if truth depends on these constantly renewed, passionate internal experiences, then the anchor for the soul has no rope.
It can easily dissolve into just mere feeling, right? And this risk gets really serious when you apply it to the core of a historical religion like Christianity. Biblical faith is anchored to specific events that supposedly happened in time, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus.
So if you push the subjective method to its extreme, which some later existential theologians did, you get to a place where the historical Jesus doesn't matter. All that matters is your subjective encounter with the message.
And you've dehistoricized the faith. That's when the critiques get really strong, citing the risk of obscurantism or even a denial of science. Can faith survive if it completely disconnects from objective, verifiable history? That tension, how to hold historical fact and personal passion together, is the challenge he leaves us with.
And that demand for authentic passion over comfortable fact that directly fuels his final, most aggressive phase.
The Gadfly's final sting.
The attack on Christendom. And it's so important to understand, he wasn't attacking Christianity as a faith system. He was launching a targeted assault on the Danish state church and what he called nominal Christianity.
He saw the established Danish church as the perfect embodiment of the Hegelian error. The church had synthesized itself with the state, creating the seamless, culturally mandatory system, and the result was an arid Christianity of citizen Christians.
People who just assumed they were believers simply because they were Danes. They were born into the culture, they were baptized as babies, and that was that.
He called it a prodigious illusion. This comfort, this cultural assumption of faith, completely obscured the painful, necessary call to individual radical conversion. It reduced the terrifying leap of faith to just empty formalism and externalism.
It turned true faith into a cultural practice, producing mere spectators who never actually had to make a real personal commitment.
His targets were sharp and precise. He railed against the social machinery of it all. He attacked the ritual of baby baptism and confirmation, arguing that these processes just manufactured Christians wholesale without requiring any of the passionate choice or the fear and trembling of the religious stage.
He argued that for the New Testament Christian, life was supposed to be uncomfortable. It was supposed to be marked by suffering and self-denial and a profound break with this world.
But his contemporaries were looking for social utility and comfort within the church, and this made the clergy a particular target of his scorn.
He didn't pull any punches there.
Not at all. He compared the established clergy, who enjoyed honor and prestige and good salaries, to swindlers and counterfeiters. He said they were betraying the radical, demanding path of the imitation of Christ. They were preaching comfort and cultural acceptance when the New Testament demanded painful renunciation.
And the intensity of this rejection lasted right up to his deathbed.
Yes, there's that famous story where he refused to take the Lord's Supper from a priest. He said the official church was a bureaucratic ritual completely sterilized of any life. He refused to validate the very institution he'd spent his last years fighting.
For him, the Christian requirement was renunciation, ignoring social utility, and embracing discomfort. He saw his whole society living in the ethical stage bound by duty and law, but falsely believing they had achieved the religious stage just by going through the motions.
It's just fascinating to realize that at this exact moment in history, Kierkegaard wasn't the only radical critic emerging from Hegel's shadow.
Right. Karl Marx, born just 5 years after Kierkegaard, was also challenging the philosophical foundations of the age. but they pointed towards solutions that were, diametrically opposed.
It's a profound philosophical schism. Both of them diagnose the alienation and dissatisfaction of the modern individual in the face of these grand systems, but their paths just diverged completely on the nature of the individual and the universe itself.
If we compare them, the contrast is so stark. For Kierkegaardian existentialism, the universe is fundamentally irrational, contingent, absurd. You create meaning through choice.
Whereas for Marxism, the universe is lawful, rational, and patterned. It's governed by historical and economic necessity, the dialectic.
And their idea of truth is completely polarized. For existentialism, the locus of truth is subjectivity, the internal life of the single individual.
For Marxism, the locus of truth is material reality, the objective conditions of production, and what they called social praxis revolutionary action.
So their primary conflict reflects that focus. For Kierkegaard, the problem is internal, despair and a lack of inwardness. The problem is spiritual.
For Marx, the problem is entirely external. Alienation caused by the means of production and economic oppression. The problem is material.
Marxists would say the individual is determined by social relations. You are who your society and class make you. Kierkegaard champions personal spontaneity and total self-determination against all institutions.
One seeks a collective, revolutionary transformation of the social order. The other demands the internal, spiritual transformation of the individual, one person at a time.
Which makes the later attempts to marry the two philosophies so interesting. I'm thinking of Jean-Paul Sartre trying to synthesize them.
Right, suggesting existentialism could be a subordinate branch of Marxism. It could acknowledge the material determination of society, but still give space for the subject's need to choose.
But purists on both sides would argue they just nullify each other. How can one philosophy rely on terrifying, irrational freedom, while the other relies on historical necessity and material reality dictating the outcome?
They really do represent two completely competing visions for how humanity should respond after the collapse of that big Hegelian promise.
But regardless of the conflict with Marx, Kierkegaard's insistence on passionate subjectivity and the intensity of the existing self proved to be incredibly fertile soil for 20th century theology and philosophy.
Oh, his work dramatically influenced major theological figures. Paul Tillich, Karl Barth, Rudolf Bultmann. Tillich built his whole method of correlation around Kierkegaard's categories, focusing on universal human issues like anxiety, guilt, and finitude as the starting point for theology.
And Bultmann famously combined Kierkegaard's focus on existence with Heidegger's philosophy. It led to a theology that emphasized the individual's existential relevance of the Christian gospel, often pushing aside traditional historical dogma to focus only on the core message and how you, the subject, appropriate it.
His core insistence remains so vital today, challenging any kind of cultural or comfortable Christianity and demanding that faith has to be a passionate, terrifying lived experience, not a set of external formalities. He's always urging the individual to find a truth which is true for me.
What an incredible journey we've taken. We started with the darkness of his youth, the crushing spiritual inheritance from his father, which really became the blueprint for his work. We moved to that critical, agonizing choice he made with Regine Olsen and used it to frame the 3 stages on life's way.
From aesthetic despair to ethical guilt, all the way to that radical, terrifying leap of faith.
We saw how he successfully broke from the grand system builders like Hegel and Marx, prioritizing the concrete, particular existence of the individual over these abstract essences and historical necessities.
His great insight was to explore the psychological failures of both the aesthetic life, which is a refusal to choose, and the ethical life, the impossibility of perfection.
His legacy is so intensely personal and it's perpetually challenging. He gave us this architectural blueprint for understanding our own inwardness, while warning us against the illusion of Christendom and the comfortable trap of a life lived without real passion or commitment.
At the end of the day, Kierkegaard suggests that existence isn't something passive that you can possess or catalog like a set of facts. It's something active. It is something to be existed, with fear and trembling.
He championed the freedom of the individual, but that freedom comes with this immense and, frankly, frightening burden.
He demands that you, the learner, acknowledge the objective uncertainty of the most important questions, and yet still commit your entire self.
Which brings us to the final thought.
If the highest truth is truly subjective and requires a passionate leap across the void of rational certainty, what absolute irrational commitment defines your own life? That's the ultimate challenge the Danish Gadfly leaves us with.